So this seems to be the Irish slot of the programme. How many people were here for Kevin's talk just now? And similar to Kevin, I'm much more interested in exploring the philosophical, historical context. I think we're living in an extraordinary moment and full of potential, and the kind of things we're discussing here are critical, I think, to this moment. But I think it's really important that we remember that these are means towards a greater end. So I'm much more interested in looking at the broader philosophical, historical context. I noticed there is a parallel program called How Not to Be Anonymous with Bitmessage. Can I suggest that if you're interested in the specific details and technicalities of cryptocurrencies, you leave right now? Because you're not going to get any of that here. I'm guessing you've made a choice consciously. That's not a random process. One more thing. The talk is entitled Is Small Still Beautiful? And that's an allusion to E.F. Schumacher's seminal book written in the 70s called Small is Beautiful. Again, it would help me to see how many of you have heard of it or read it. A few. So a real seminal book in terms of, well, we'll come more, we'll begin to circle around why it's seminal and why it's particularly relevant to this moment. So Fritz Schumacher, German economist living in England, died 50 years ago. But he asks questions and presents, one of these thinkers who is so far ahead of his time that the ideas that he's working with circle back with more resonance second time around, third time around. What's really interesting is that he was profoundly techno-skeptical. And so my question of asking, I'm kind of trying to channel Fritz and think, what would Fritz have thought of this information technology revolution? And that question leads me to a real excitement as an educator. So I'm an educator in the field of economics, ecological economics, and there's nothing more exciting for an educator than finding students synthesizing things that appear to be completely incompatible. When we're working with a dichotomy and suddenly you look at it, you realize that actually the language and the narratives we're using are keeping these two things apparently incompatible, but through the process of releasing the power of the language, being flexible in how you really experience, so really seeing what's happening and releasing conventional terms like left and right and capitalism and communism and finding that what appear to be incompatible may just be compatible. And I think we're sitting with one of these at the moment in terms of the whole question of techno-skepticism and techno-optimism. And I want to come at that, but with a little autobiographical detail. I was brought up in Ireland in the 60s. It was a world of space travel. The Labour government in Britain won. Their slogan was the white heat of technology. There was moon travel. On television every night there were these guys in white coats in laboratories talking about a future in which genetic modification would feed the world and robots would solve all our problems. Effectively, it was the last great era where people deeply believed in technology. I then spent much of the rest of my adult life watching the promises crash to the ground, watching genetic modification denude the soils, drive peasants from the land, create dead zones in the oceans where the nitrates ran off, creating a mountain of debt, watching the nuclear dream die, both in terms of nuclear weapon proliferation and what to do with nuclear waste. There's a whole stream of these techno dreams collapsing. My working life took me to Africa, where I saw directly the impact of one-size-fits-all modernist industrialization, steamroller, paying no attention to the cultural context of each individual place. It was simply the same story, the same medicine for every single culture, which was privatization, liberalization, industrialization, and of course the the people I was living with, 80–90% of whom were living close to the land, had no power over this technology at all. It was completely destructive of their cultural coherence and integrity. So I grew up as part of a generation that noticed two things. The first thing was that with every wave of, so every 50 or 60 years in the history of capitalism, along has come a new technological frontier. So canals, steam, steel, chemical engineering, mass production, electricity, mass broadcasting, and with each of these waves, an ever greater concentration of power and wealth in the hands of the few. So noticing the technological development appears to be run in parallel with and to generate ever increasing inequality in terms of who controls the means of production and who gets the wealth. I'm realizing that quite a lot of what I'm saying may be contested, so I'm planning to keep the presentation relatively short, so as to leave good space for conversation. Certainly the story that I grew up with was that each wave of technological development further concentrated power into the hands of a smaller number of people as a means of production, focused, concentrated. It's interesting that Karl Marx I'm talking about, not Groucho, had a very paradoxical relationship to this, because on the one hand, he hated the consequences of, as a moral being, he hated the consequences of capitalism, but he celebrated the efficiency of capitalism as being the most efficient way of exploiting the full potential of these technologies on the path to transcending capitalism and socialism, moving towards socialism and communism. But definitely the period that I lived through, particularly watching the impact on cultures in Africa, was devastation and ever greater concentration of power. So that on the one hand. On the other, noticing that those who remained techno-optimists, those who were primarily still sitting with the story that technology will be our salvation, or an important part of our salvation, seemed to be unwilling or unable to grasp the real root of the problem, which was political and economic disparity. So in other words, the theory being, if only we can grow the size of the cake even more, then everybody can benefit. And if we do that, we don't need to address core causes of inequality in terms of power and access to resources. So that's my story. I've been involved heavily in community economic development, in transition towns initiatives, in eco-villages. I used to be the president of the Global Eco-Village Network. These are all organizations and initiatives which are instinctively hostile to the technological frontier, which see it as being part of the problem, and very much more focused on social innovation, on community development. And that's a world, I have to say, in which the great majority, it's really astounding to see so many men. I almost always work with majority women who tend to be more interested in the social innovation. So it's a really stark something happening there. So that, I notice, is the story that I've got. The story that, and it's not just me, it's representative of my generation, is I got this story that there is human scale development and there is technological development, and they are incompatible. And certainly Fritz Schumacher in Small is Beautiful is a continual, again, he's working with this core assumption that all the experience we have with the new technological frontier is that it is ever more incompatible with people taking their own destiny in their own hands, and noticing, like, again, it's something that's really interesting in the economics course that I teach, is that we draw as heavily from anthropology, sociology, psychology as we do from economics. So looking at truly who are we as a species, not this mythical, what's called homo economicus, this perfectly rational, individualist, utility maximizing individual at the heart of conventional economic thought, but really who are we as a species, and seeing that we are a meaning-making species that is, for whom quality of relationship is critical. Like our success as a species is precisely because of our ability to cooperate. Well-being, again, one of Schumacher's great insights when he came back he wrote a wonderful essay called Buddhist Economics after a visit to Burma. And in Buddhist economics, he came back with 2 insights which totally undermine conventional approaches to economics. One is that he found in Burma, in the Buddhist culture, that people achieved abundance not by maximizing their consumption, but by reducing their needs. So seeing that actually consumerism is a real false satisfier of our true needs. The second insight he came back with was that in conventional economic theory, work is a disutility and consumption is a utility. So in other words, we go through the boring stuff, which is work, in order to earn the money to buy the stuff that brings us satisfaction. And Schumacher came back from Burma saying, wrong. That quality of life and meaning in life comes from high quality work. So very much more a people-centered, participatory relations, like an economy that is indistinguishable from healthy community and which is primarily relational rather than transactional. So what I'm trying to do here is to build up this dichotomy, this apparent polarity between techno-optimism, where the technological frontier will solve our solutions, and where I've always stood and where Fritz Schumacher stood, which is wrong. That the historical record is in exactly the opposite direction. And what we need to be doing is we need to be slowing the technological innovation, in fact reversing it, and moving back into a much more hands-based, hands-on, craft-based, where we have much more time for each other and to do meaningful work. So to make our economies consciously less efficient so we've got more time for ourselves and each other. So that's the conventional dichotomy, technology optimists, technology skeptics. And I've been clearly here. And now I'm not so sure that it's even a dichotomy. Let's get a roving mic.
Could I just ask you to clarify the 2 sides of that?
Sure.
Why they are needed. So on the one hand, we want technology. On the one hand, we want better social relationships. But what are the requirements for? What are the sort of goals that each of those sides is trying to achieve?
Sure. So it seems to me that that conventional economic theory has assumed, again, because the assumption is that consumption is utility. So they don't use the word well-being, but our well-being is associated with the consumption of consumer products. And therefore, if we can introduce technology that will enable us to produce more goods at lower cost, it's a good thing. And so that's up here. At this end, it's an explicit focus on well-being, saying that actually this story that we are fulfilled through our consumption activities is simply wrong. And that if you look at the anthropological, the sociological, the psychological record, you'll see that relationships, slowing down, having time for ourselves and each other is much more significant. And the technology is taking us in exactly the wrong direction, the technological development to date. Is that clear? You're still not sure?
So these are aiming directly for the same goal, but people disagree on whether it's technology that should achieve it.
Yeah. So certainly the conventional economists would say that they're also seeking to maximize well-being, but the well-being would be defined rather unconsciously in terms of the availability of consumer goods.
I see.
So it's a much more materialist and community-based or spiritual dichotomy.
So they both want better quality of life, but one wants to do it by getting more consumer goods, the other wants it to do by more meaningful relationships.
Indeed. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to take one more question. I want to finish the story because I'm only halfway through. Should I continue? Yeah, let me continue. So this is what I was saying at the beginning is exciting me as an educator when what appears to be a dichotomy, when you soften the gaze, soften the focus, and begin to, and have an open mind. There's no better way of demonstrating that you have a mind than by changing it occasionally. And I must say at the moment, I'm in the process of a process of excitement looking at the information technology, renewable energy revolution, the latest great wave, technological wave to sweep through our economies and society. And the excitement is that whereas every previous technological wave has concentrated power into the hands of corporations and governments, this one has demonstrated at least the potential of moving in exactly the opposite direction, of favoring the distributed and the networked over the centralized. So if we play this right, my feeling is that historians of the near future will look back to this moment in history and say what happened was extraordinary, and what happened was that the next great wave of innovation to happen in capitalism favored, made more profitable distributed network decentralized systems relative to centralized systems. The critical word being, the ugly word, disintermediation. So for the 20th century, our transactions in all fields were mediated by these giant centralized bureaucracies and organizations. Corporations, governments, trade unions, the health service, banks, and in publishing houses, television companies, and in sector after sector, there is evidence of disintermediation, of the technology of enabling people, enabling citizens to cooperate in peer-to-peer co-production systems in ways that enable them to sidestep these giant organizations that dominated the 20th century. So most obviously in the context that many of the presentations are about here is money, is finding ways of enabling exchanges that bypass the banks. In education, in my own field, the dominant player in the 20th century was the university. Ugly, inefficient, top-heavy, really destructive of so much of what is best in education. Again, the internet is enabling co-teaching through MOOCs, massive open online courses, and many other ways for educators and those seeking to be educated to work together without going through the universities. Farmers across the world have created platforms through which they are able to communicate their experience and share techniques for seed saving and other production advice that is enabling them to do that collaboratively rather than through Monsanto and the other giant food organizations, corporations that have dominated the 20th century. And I think if you look, I mean, just one more example, again, is that the blogosphere is much more interesting than most newspapers. And most newspapers, there have been very few newspapers at the moment who are making a profit, most are making a loss. And they really don't have a business model to stay competitive to the world citizens speaking to each other, not through the mediation of the newspapers and the media companies, but directly to each other. This is happening through sector by sector. So I'm sitting here going, but there's this neat dichotomy where there is the foolish technophiles who are ignoring issues of power and rank, and the community-based decentralizers here, because actually this technological revolution offers at least the possibility that they are compatible. Am I communicating this? Are you getting a sense of why I might be excited? I'm seeing some nodding heads. For me, it's like, wow, this is amazing. It kind of contradicts all my core basic stories, or many of the important ones, which really thrills me. However, those of us who are used to being here are still pretty deeply skeptical because there's been so many promises before that have gone wrong. So many of like for example, the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, it's such a song and dance, and then we get Uber and Airbnb, and which enables peer-to-peer sharing, but it's a venture capitalist model which delivers all the profits to the same. In fact, a significantly greater concentration of power. So Airbnb, the world's biggest hotel company that doesn't even have the expense of paying for one hotel, and Uber doesn't own one single taxi. So never before has there been a business model that has delivered, that has leveraged such a rate of profitability for the venture capitalists. So it seems to me, what I've done this week is I've sat and I've chatted to Fritz and I've gone, okay, Fritz, so what are the caveats? What are like for this to work, for the historians of the near future to reflect back and go, Jesus, they did it. They really used this technology to enable a decentralized, ethical, ecologically regenerative culture using this technology, what are the caveats? What are the obstacles? What do we need to make sure that we do to ensure? I'm going to finish. I'm almost finished, and I'm going to go through each. I see there being 5 areas of reasonable skepticism. Skepticism that these are questions that we need to be asking, that we need to address in order for historians of the near future to look back on us and go, they really did it. One is the one I've just mentioned, is noticing that the platforms that have been enabled by the technological revolution are hyper-capitalism. It's capitalism on steroids. So it does enable sharing, but the profits from that sharing activity are sequestered by the same old multinational corporations that continue to control ultimately what happens on the platforms. So, and here what we need to be doing, and again there's a lot of interesting work happening in this area, is to create cooperatively owned platforms. So create a platform that is owned by the drivers of Uber, or creating an Airbnb that is owned and democratically controlled by the people who are providing the service, is one. 2 is addressing, and I'm very sensitive to this given the fact that I spent about 20 years living and working in rural Africa, is the global inequality in terms of access. This cannot be liberation for us, again at the expense of the economically poorer parts of the world. So we really do need to be focusing on rolling out the technology, not just in the rich industrialized parts, but globally. 3 is the resource and energy intensity of the internet. It gives the impression of being like we don't see that every time we click and we Google and search, but the infrastructure and the operating, the energetic and the material costs of establishing and maintaining and working the infrastructure that enables this meshwork of communication to happen is very heavy, and we need to find ways of reducing the footprint. 4 is the use at the minute by the state and by corporations as a surveillance tool. So there's a real, I mean, it's not a real danger, it's an actuality that the world's police forces, militaries, corporations, governments are using the technology in ways that do not favor a decentralized, fair, equitable society. So we cannot assume that the technology on its own is going to do it. We must remain aware. We must remain aware of the political power issues involved and be active campaigning citizens. And finally, and I think this may be the most important, is this, and it's something that we really focus on. Schumacher College, where I teach in England, is we call ourselves an ecological college. And really, one of the most important things we're trying to address is what we call nature deficit disorder. So the tendency of the technology to suck us in our urbanized lives, and that we need to be in love with each other and with the earth. And we can only do that. We are carbon-based, sensual beings who have co-evolved with the rest of the beauty of creation. We need to be in communion with our fellow species, brothers and sisters out there, to remember who we are as a species and to keep it as a living relationship of love rather than some sort of abstract relationship to nature. So I'm just going to go through those 5 again, and then I'm going to finish. So just to summarize, it seems to me, again, as an educator, it's very exciting to find a moment where one is challenged to see what appeared to be a dichotomy as actually a synthesis of potentially compatible ways of seeing the world, of stories that appear to be separate coming together. And I think we're at a moment where, again, I'm repeating myself again, but I do think that historians in the near future may well look back at this moment and go, this was a major turning point in human history, because for the first time the technological revolution opens the possibility of favouring decentralized, distributed network systems over centralized. There's lots of evidence of this coming in, sector by sector. However, 5 things. I'm going to go back to my list. Yep, the current dominance by conventional capitalism and steroids corporations of the platforms that we currently have, and the need to create ones that are democratically, cooperatively owned and managed. The need to spread the web globally and not just restrict it to the economically richer parts of the world. To be politically vigilant in the face of the surveillance state using the same technology towards different ends. And the looking at addressing the energy and resource intensity of the web and realizing this is not compatible with the transition to an ecologically sustainable world, and remembering to go and walk in the woods from time to time and get out of our back bedrooms. That's it.
It's time for the question, so here comes the first one.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Dali. First, I want to acknowledge that I am kind of in both camps, the eco-villages and the hackers as well, and as well as other fringe communities. And I really never thought of it as dichotomy. To me, it seemed profoundly compatible, all these things that are happening around. And I'd say, like, is there any real problem with technology or with the kind of social innovations that are happening in the eco-villages? Both camps have a lot of their own problems. But for me, it's much more about that all these things are just symptoms of some kind of progression in a mindset that is happening. People being more and more able to comprehend reality in a richer context, to think more complex. And sometimes they drive it more through technological exploration, sometimes more through their kind of social rituals, whatever is happening in the villages. But to me, the compatibility and the kind of common ground, what happens here is that when I go to these fringe communities, what I see is people that are much more likely able to think openly, to kind of get a more complex picture of the reality, to talk openly with the respect, to exchange ideas, to be able to challenge them, to kind of, build on them, as opposed would be to go somewhere to the Donald Trump rally or the equivalent in this country, where I would see much lower or probably 0% of this kind of people. So I think these camps are just 2 different sides of some people need a bit more technology right now, some need a bit more of eco-villages, but it's fundamentally going into some kind of progression in the openness, the mindset.
I think there may well be a generational issue here as well. Like, I think it may well be that my generation was so comprehensively, like, if you are techno-optimist, it means you're for nuclear power and GM. Effectively, that's what it means. And so it means that you're oblivious to the ecological consequences and you're not prepared to look at the real issues of power dynamic. So that definitely, and so maybe I should just be speaking, I should be sharing my enthusiasm with my generation, going, wow, we were wrong. But I suspect not entirely, because I think that it is true that, that definitely the kind of fringe communities that you're talking about do tend to be much more flexible, like distinguishing between the labels we put on things and the things themselves, much more questioning, much more healthily skeptical. But I think it remains objectively true that the last great wave of technological innovation before the current one was the mass production revolution. And that one was a revolution that flattened and alienated humans from their true nature more than any other. And so in the context of the mass production revolution, to grow up feeling technology is by definition driving us in the wrong direction was not an unreasonable story. But definitely at the moment, and I think aided by the nature of the current revolution, there is at least a possibility. Although the capacity of venture capitalism to transmute and to incorporate and co-opt is astonishing, which is why the 5 caveats are there. Let's not assume that the technology will look after this revolution all by itself. But let's remember that that all the projects we're working on are the means towards a greater end. The object is not technological evolution. The end is human flourishing on a healthy planet. And I think my feelings that those of us who feel really instinctively rooted in place-based sensual communities, that's probably our gift to the techies, is what you're doing is fantastic, but don't see it as being the end. It's a means towards a greater end.
I have two questions. One question is, can you repeat again what the role of the governments or of the states will be in your vision? And did you look into polycentric law? This is question number one.
Did I look at what?
Polycentric law.
Yeah.
I think it's even more decentralization of everything.
Yeah.
I don't know it too much,
Sure,
but
I got it.
yeah.
So let me come back to that, and then you can hold the microphone. Conventionally, what has happened, like a big part of the reason for the alienation of people from the political process is because the political process has been pretty much captured by corporations. So generally, the state, both at national and at local level, tends to be explicitly or implicitly in partnership with capital. So if you're doing training as a local economic development officer, the training you will get, and it will be, what incentives can I offer to Microsoft to get them to locate in my place? I see very little significantly interesting innovation at the policy level happening at the national level, but at the city level, I see lots. And in Europe, particularly Barcelona and Bologna in Italy, are really pioneering conscious partnership with citizens, with civil society, and really inviting a long-term engaged resource relations with citizens to, and this really is the urban commons movement. Maybe I can just build on that to say that in terms of what, in terms of, other than addressing these 5 weaknesses or 5 caveats to my techno-optimism, like in terms of one broad thrust of what we should be doing strategically, it's building partnership between digital commoners and place-based commoners. So around the world, it's estimated that around 40% of the world's population, their livelihoods are still, at least to some degree, dependent on access to their commons, to the fisheries, the resources that traditionally have been managed by the commons, but that increasingly are under assault, because this is where the remaining oil, rare earth metals, minerals are. And the alliances that are happening between green environmental groups and indigenous peoples around the world at the moment, really exciting in terms of how can we help each other protect the remaining wilderness lands on the earth. And I think that a lot of the indigenous people and the others who are part of what I'm loosely calling the global commons movement, trying to retain control of the land, the resources that they live on and with, that they retain much of the natural love of the earth and the values base, the heart. Like, I think the head is here, and this is dichotomizing again, but the big heart, and remembering that what we're doing is in service to a greater thing, is more found in the global south than the global north. We have more of the cleverness and the technological power, and so there is a natural marriage there waiting to happen where we can learn from each other. There's a couple of...
So, yeah, sorry, I have a second question, if it's okay. I will try. You said that you talked about capitalism, but I wanted to ask you if we have capitalism in Europe.
Say it again.
Do we really have capitalism, in your opinion? In Europe or in the Western world, is it capitalism what we have here?
I still haven't understood. I'm so sorry.
Capitalism?
Capitalism, yeah.
Yeah. You talked about it in your speech, but I was wondering if it is in fact capitalism that we have as economic system.
If our economic system is capitalism. I mean, capitalism is a lazy word because there's so many Scandinavian capitalism is different from Chinese capitalism, it is different from British capitalism. I mean, so there's so many different types. And if you really look at the value in our society, so much of that value comes not from capitalist modes of production, but from sharing economy modes, from government spending, so the capitalism is only part of our economy, and they're different capitalisms. So again, we need to be suspicious, like as we're truly understanding what's happening, let's not assume that because we're using one word that it's describing the same phenomenon everywhere. Thank you. And sorry for my lack of understanding.
Well, you said we need to be suspicious. Well, I am suspicious. What do you mean by capitalism?
What do I mean by capitalism? Yeah, I mean, my definition of capitalism leads me to be excited about what's happening at the moment, because my definition would be that the means of production are held by those who own the capital. That capital employs labor rather than labor employing capital.
How much money do you need to have in order for it to be considered a capital?
Well, certainly with each wave of industrial development, you've needed more and more until the current wave. And the current wave, like if you really think about the open source, like if what has happened with Wikipedia and software and publishing and education really moves into the sphere of production, the means of production becomes a laptop and access to a 3D printer. And so by that definition, there's a growing number of publications that somewhere in the title have the words, "the demise of capitalism." Jeremy Rifkin's The Zero Marginal Cost Society, Paul Mason's Post-Capitalism. There's many books that are looking at the inherent implications of this technological revolution. And for example, they're seeing that as information moves central to the economy, that information is what economists call non-rival. Now, non-rival means I can have it and you can have it too, so we're not in competition. In fact, within networks, the more people that share it, the better. So Facebook's value is enhanced the more people who share it.
But Facebook is owned by quite a rich guy, isn't it?
Say it again.
I mean, you said that capitalism means that rich guy produce wealth.
Well, it's not individuals. It's not. You can't associate this with individuals, but it is that the means of production are controlled by those who have the money assets.
All right, but in Facebook there is no production of goods, is there? I mean, Facebook is not about production of goods; it's about communicating.
It is. But what I invited you to consider was that if you think about what's happened in many of these other spheres now, it's threatening to spill over into the field of production. It's already beginning with some 3D printing.
I mean, I agree. I just wanted to know what do you mean by capitalism when using it for a whole lecture. That's all. But
okay. So my definition of capitalism is the one I gave, that the means of means of production are controlled by those who have the wealth. And right. we need to move away from that to a much more cooperatively, a much more interesting range of ownership.
But everyone has some wealth. I mean, it's not like it doesn't have.
Yes, but the decisions on whether we are turning Borneo into one mass monocultural plantation of palm oil, rather than each region creating oils and grains that are relevant to their own particular context, are not being made by ordinary people. They're being made by the 1% who are sitting on the wealth, I suggest.
Hi. Actually, I'm African and European, and you mentioned actually earlier about Africa. So, but actually I don't really get what you were saying. So if you could be a little bit more specific about your vision in terms of how you got inspired by your, several years in Africa, in the sense, the African in me actually doesn't really feel concerned about the whole movement of decentralization, because we've always been sharing economy over there. And we are actually dreaming of having what by this decentralized system we're giving away, meaning the tools, the industry, the capitalism system that we're nowadays trying to run away from. Because, well, politics, economics Actually, even though, you know, I'm not going to go back to the history, but we're still paying the price of what happened like 60 years ago. So that's what the African in me feels like. I mean, you guys are talking about all these technical things where even the basics I still don't have access to. But the European in me, though, is really exciting about the technology. Because technology is really, I mean, it's thrilling to be digging the code, playing with all these figures, and also eventually even becoming rich through Bitcoin. So there is kind of, you know, schizophrenia, and I'd like to.
Where are you from?
Central African Republic and Rwanda.
Rwanda.
And Central African Republic. So
Yeah.
like one of the least developed country in the world, another one that had actually the genocide that everyone know.
Yeah.
So my story makes that I'm more interested about the technology than, I mean, the philosophy, of course, because we're living in a time where the government, I mean, they just pulled pulled the string way too much. So even I cannot understand or, I mean, cannot actually agree with what's going on. But because we reach like a point of no return. But the African in me is still way back. I mean, just cannot relate to that disease. And that's why probably when you mentioned the fact that you're all men, that's definitely a fact, because there is definitely a lot more to do in terms of gender equality, even in that debate. And in terms of diversity, there is no diversity at all, because most people from developed country, except if they're from India, because they have the technology and all stuff, they just cannot relate to what's going on in Western European countries. And people could definitely go toward your direction if maybe people will also be ready to give away all the privileges that we take as granted. Our smartphones that are made with, with products that are actually digged in mines in African country, or the fact that we all have a Facebook account, or using Apple product, or wearing Nike product, and whatever. So it's nice to be part of this whole community, but then I'm not sure people are ready to give away all these, these things that makes our life easier.
Okay. So we could spend the next week in discussion. Just to say that my understanding, my reading of what happened was just a short bit of history. In the 1970s, there were two Arab-Israeli wars, 73 and 78. Both times the West sided with Israel. Saudi Arabia created the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They tightened their fist around the noose of oil supplies. So anybody else remember the 3-day week in Britain? Now, we've down to a 3-day week. There was simply the lights went off. There was no power. President Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House. It was real emergency. And this put a lot of money into Swiss banks, what were called euro dollars. Because the Saudi Arabians, I'm wondering if I need to go into this level of detail, but let me just, since I've started down the road. So a lot of money accumulating in the economies of Saudi Arabia and these Middle Eastern countries they didn't know what to do with, so they give it to the banks. And the European banks, the young men in the European banks, as in the 80s in Europe, are given huge commissions to get rid of this money, lend it to whoever. And they lent it to Bokassa, these bloodthirsty dictators who at least were our dictators in the Cold War context. They lent it to Marcos, they lent it to Latin American dictators up and down the continent. And then these countries became hugely indebted. So across Africa, across Latin America, massively indebted, interest rates go up, the dictators are displaced, and the people are landed with these huge debts they can never possibly repay. And then the World Bank and the IMF come in and go, you want to borrow money? Sure, we'll lend you money. But in order to do it, you've got to completely liberalize your economies, open it up to Western influence. You've got to abolish. So we will retain our agricultural subsidies. Thank you. 40% of the European Union budget devoted to agricultural subsidies. So we dump products in African markets below producer prices. But you have got to liberalize your economies completely in order to get access to finance. And so these countries in Africa and Latin America had no choice but and it was a one-size-fits-all. It was the same if you were in Nicaragua, if you were in Costa Rica, if you were in Philippines, if you were in Congo, if you're in Rwanda, same policy. Liberalize, privatize, devalue the currency, open it up to international competition. Western businesses flood the economy. Local people can't possibly compete. and they are moved from being to having some measure of democratic control over their own, basing their economy on their own cultural coherence, to being completely absorbed overnight into the Western globalized economy and turned into wage slaves from having been having had a measure of democratic control over their own economies. So in other words, the history of Latin America and particularly Africa was simply taken over on using debt as the weapon. So, and it broke my heart. I lived in a dozen different African countries, longest in Ghana, and just watching nominally democratic governments, but there was nothing they could do because the World Bank and the IMF were controlled the Ministry of Finance. So, and we could talk much more about it, but disaster.